Hello, dear soul. I'm so glad you're here. If your day has felt heavy or your thoughts just won't settle tonight, this sleep story is here to help you soften the edges of your mind. Tonight, we continue our journey into the quiet corners of power, not the wars or the victories, but the strange royal laws whispered behind velvet curtains and the human fears that hid beneath golden crowns. This is history for sleep, where weird history becomes a soft lullaby and the strangest things ever written into law gently lead us toward stillness. And before we begin, I'd love to ask something simple but quietly fascinating. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? It always amazes me that one story spoken gently in the dark can stretch across oceans and time zones, reaching night owls in cities, early risers in villages, and tired hearts everywhere in between. And if this story brings you peace, or if you'd like to come back here the next time the world feels loud, you can always subscribe. Now, let's return to the candlelit halls of strange empires and the kings and queens who ruled with laws no one ever expected. Let me ask you something. If you were one of the most powerful men in the world, with palaces, armies, and absolute command, what's the very first thing you would ban? Would it be crime, corruption, chaos? Napoleon Bonaparte banned smiling, not in public, not on the streets, but in something far more permanent, his official portraits. At the height of his power, Napoleon quietly issued a decree that would shape his legacy forever. In every painting of the emperor, there would be no emotion, no curve of the lips, no glint of joy in the eyes, no vulnerability of any kind. The face of Napoleon would be a mask. Why? Because he understood something that few rulers dared to acknowledge. The future only remembers what you tell it to, and a smile, as innocent as it may seem, was far too human. He didn't want to be remembered as a man. He wanted to be remembered as a symbol. His official artist, Jacques-Louis David, became the architect of that illusion. In portrait after portrait, Napoleon appeared calm, cold, untouchable. He was shown crossing the Alps like a god, not a general, seated on his throne like an idea, not a person. Behind closed doors, witnesses described him differently. He laughed, he flirted, he ranted. But the world would never see that version, because according to his silent law, Napoleon was never to be caught in the act of feeling, and artists who broke that rule, their paintings were politely rejected or mysteriously lost. It's strange, isn't it? To command millions and still be afraid of a smile. But for Napoleon, that was the danger. A smile is warmth. Warmth is weakness. And weakness cracks the marble. So tonight, as you breathe in slowly and drift toward sleep, picture the dim glow of a Paris studio, a painter's brush trembling slightly in the lamplight, and an emperor sitting in silence, not posing as he was, but as he needed to be, still, stone-faced, immortal. Because in Napoleon's empire, even the soft curve of a smile was too powerful to allow. If you were the emperor of a great empire, surrounded by generals, ministers, and royal advisors, and someone asked, Who belongs in your court? Would you say chickens? Because that's what Ferdinand I of Austria is remembered for. He ruled an empire, he wore the crown, and according to the quiet, feathered whispers of history, he once insisted that chickens attend royal council meetings, not as food, not as pets, but as participants. The story sounds like myth, but it begins in a very real place, the grand gold-trimmed Habsburg palaces of 19th century Vienna, where everything glittered, except the mind of the man in charge. Ferdinand had been born into royal blood, but also into fragility, epileptic, intellectually delayed, and constantly prodded by palace doctors. He lived much of his life behind a veil of confusion. Still, in 1835, he was crowned emperor, not because he was ready, but because the system said he must. And that's when the strange decrees began. He once demanded that every course of a banquet be made from dumplings. When told this wasn't possible, he stood up and thundered, "I am the emperor, and I want dumplings." So they gave him dumplings, dozens of them, every dish, from appetizer to dessert. But the dumplings were only the beginning. There were stories, soft, uncertain stories, that Ferdinand issued a decree allowing chickens to join court meetings. One version says they were seated in little chairs. Another says he tried to give one a title, and maybe he did. Or maybe the court just nodded, bowed, and did what it always did, turned royal nonsense into soft pageantry. Because here's the secret of Ferdinand's reign. He ruled in name, but not in truth. His ministers devised a quiet system, a delicate choreography of misdirection. If he declared war, they gave him a parade. If he requested the stars be rearranged, they bought him a telescope. And if he asked for chickens in the council chamber, they probably let a few hens wander the garden outside. He wasn't mocked, he was protected, and in a strange way, cherished. Eventually, during the revolutions of 1848, Ferdinand stepped down. He gave up the throne with no resistance and spent the rest of his life in peaceful seclusion, reading fairy tales, feeding ducks, and humming to birds from the castle windows. He died old, quiet, and, by all accounts, content. And history? It mostly passed him by, but not entirely, because sometimes it's not the sword or the crown that lingers, but the image of a gentle man lost in a palace of velvet and fog, believing that chickens belonged at the table of kings. So as you drift deeper tonight, let your mind wander through candlelit halls, past velvet drapes and sleeping courtiers, and into a small royal room where the emperor is speaking softly, sweetly, to a chicken, and no one dares tell him she isn't listening. If you were leading a holy war, if your crown was heavy with destiny, and your throne stood at the heart of a Catholic empire, would you still have time for soap? Because according to centuries of whispers, Queen Isabella of Castile, the same Isabella who helped unite Spain, who funded Columbus's voyage, who wore velvet-like armor, once vowed not to bathe until the war was won. The year was 1482. The last Islamic kingdom on the Iberian Peninsula, the Emirate of Granada, still stood defiant. Isabella and her husband, King Ferdinand of Aragon, had declared a crusade to reclaim the land for Christian Spain. It was the final chapter in a centuries-long campaign known as the Reconquista. And Isabella, fierce, devout, unyielding, made a promise. she would not wash her body, not once, until the final Moorish city fell. Whether this was an act of penance, devotion, or defiance, no one could say, but the vow stuck, like smoke, like history. And so the legend began. 3 years passed, then 4. Still the war dragged on, and still Isabella held her vow. It is said, though perhaps exaggerated in later years, that her garments grew dark with wear, her skin chafed from dust and sweat, and her ladies-in-waiting began lighting incense whenever she entered the room. Yet no one dared question her, because this was Isabella, the Catholic queen, the Lioness of Castile. She ruled armies. She answered only to God. When Granada finally surrendered in 1492, after a brutal 10-year campaign, she is said to have walked through the Alhambra in the same dress she wore when the war began, and only then did she bathe. Now let's pause. Was it true? Did she really go 10 years without touching water? Modern historians doubt the full tale. They suspect it may have been a political myth, crafted to portray Isabella as a martyr queen, willing to sacrifice beauty, comfort, even hygiene, for the sake of faith and victory. But truth or legend, the story endured. And for centuries afterward, her name became associated not just with conquest, but with a kind of sacred, fragrant stubbornness. Ironically, while she was remembered for refusing to wash, her reign marked the beginning of Spain's Golden Age, a time of great exploration, religious transformation, and strange contradictions. So tonight, as the night deepens around you, imagine a queen in a darkened chamber, kneeling on stone, wrapped in the same threadbare cloth she wore to war, not out of filth, but out of fury, out of purpose. A woman who chose discomfort as a form of power. Because in the shadows of history, not all decrees were written on paper. Some were written on skin. Not all wars are fought with swords. Some are waged with pamphlets and rage. Tonight we drift into 17th century England, a land of cobblestone alleys, coal fires, and quiet revolutions. And in the great halls of Whitehall Palace sits a king, pen in hand, furious at the rising trend of his time, smoking. His name was James the Third Scholar, poet, King of England and Scotland, and the author of what might be history's most passionate anti-smoking manifesto, a counterblast to tobacco. It wasn't a whisper. It was a royal roar. In 1604, disturbed by the sudden popularity of this New World weed, James put his thoughts to paper, and they were dramatic. He called tobacco loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, and dangerous to the lungs. He described smokers as foolish, their breath as stinking, their habit as barbaric. And then he made it law. He passed a heavy import tax on tobacco, a decree designed not just to raise money, but to make smoking so expensive it would vanish from public life. Tobacco had arrived in England only a few decades earlier, brought back from the Americas. At first, it was exotic, smoked by sailors, nobles, even physicians who believed it might cure plague or melancholia. But to James, it was an invasion. He believed it corrupted the senses, weakened the body, and made Englishmen resemble savages. He even claimed that God himself disapproved. And so, he took aim. His court discouraged pipe use. Portraits of James show him posed with books, not smoke. and his written decree, the counterblast, circulated across Europe, becoming one of the earliest and fiercest public health rants in history. Of course, people didn't stop smoking. Not then, not ever. In fact, James's tax simply made tobacco a luxury item, more desirable than before. His son, Charles I, would later lean into the profits, and the habit grew. But James remained bitter. He didn't just dislike smoke. He despised the idea of it, the way it curled into places it didn't belong, the way it drifted into courts, into lungs, into fashion, uninvited. For a king obsessed with order and clarity, tobacco was chaos, a cloud that refused to obey. So tonight, as you breathe in quietly and let the stillness settle over you, imagine a king at his desk, scratching angry lines across parchment, swatting at invisible smoke, and trying through ink and law to push back a rising fog. Because sometimes a royal decree isn't about power, it's about control, and a king trying to silence what he cannot contain. What makes someone unworthy of love? A crime, a betrayal, a scandal, or a profession? This is a story of power, image, and the quiet fear that beauty and brilliance might slip beyond control. In the golden heart of the Byzantine Empire, where silk shimmered beneath marble domes and laws were carved as if into the fabric of heaven, Emperor Justinian I made a royal decree: no actress was allowed to marry a noble. Not just frowned upon, forbidden. It was the 6th century. Constantinople was thriving, a crossroads of empire and empire's end. And Justinian, who dreamed of restoring the glory of Rome, believed that law could shape not only armies and cities, but love. At the time, actresses and performers, particularly those from the theater or circus, were viewed as improper. Women of the stage were often associated with sensuality, laughter, and scandal. They danced, they sang, they made emperors blush, and Justinian distrusted it all. So he passed a law: any woman who had performed publicly, especially in the theater, could never marry into the upper classes. It was a decree of morality, he said, a way to keep virtue clean and nobility untangled from temptation. But here's where the story twists, because Justinian broke his own law. Her name was Theodora. Before she became Empress, Theodora had been exactly what the law forbade: an actress, a performer, a woman of wit, beauty, and defiance. She had toured the stages of Constantinople, captivated crowds with her voice, and lived a life of survival and spectacle. By law, she was untouchable. By custom, she was unworthy. And yet, Justinian loved her. When he chose her as his bride, the court was scandalized. So Justinian did what emperors do when the rules don't fit their desires. He rewrote the law. For Theodora alone, he made an exception. He passed a decree that allowed former actresses of moral character to marry freely, just in time for their wedding. He crowned her empress, and she became one of the most powerful women in Byzantine history. Together they ruled as partners. Her name appeared beside his in laws and decrees. She advised him on rebellions, religion, and reform. The woman once banned from nobility now stood above it. And yet, after Theodora's death, Justinian quietly let the old law return. as if her life had been the exception, not the change. Why? Perhaps the court pressured him. Perhaps the illusion of order had to be preserved. Or perhaps, deep down, he believed that no one else would ever be like her. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine a velvet curtain drawn back on a moonlit stage where a woman once danced beneath chandeliers and later ruled beneath a crown. And ask yourself, was the law written to protect the nobility or to contain the fear of what one brilliant, dangerous woman could do? Imagine this. You walk into the Roman Senate, one of the most powerful institutions in the ancient world, and find a notice pinned to the marble wall. No togas, no sandals, no grapes. This is a story of suspicion, indulgence, and a ruler who feared the power of pleasure. It happened under the rule of Emperor Domitian, a man whose name still sends ripples through Roman history, equal parts feared, admired, and quietly mocked. Domitian came to power in the 1st century AD, and unlike many of his predecessors, he wanted order, sharp lines, quiet rooms, no drama in the Senate, no chaos in the streets. He was, in many ways, a control addict, and nothing bothered him more than what he couldn't control. Which brings us to grapes. In Rome, grapes didn't just mean fruit, they meant wine, and wine meant influence. You see, Roman senators didn't just debate policy, they drank, they toasted, they held late-night banquets where decisions were loosened by laughter and sometimes swayed by the cup. Domitian despised this. He believed wine blurred reason, turned serious men into jesters, and more than anything, he feared that behind the drunken toasts, there might be rebellion. So in a move that shocked the aristocracy, he issued a royal decree. No grapes, fresh or fermented, were to be brought into the Senate. No feasting during discussion. No glasses beneath robes, no wine hidden in silver flasks. Even trays of fruit were removed. Some senators scoffed, others obeyed in silence. But the message was clear. This was Domitian's Rome, and he would rule not just the laws, but the mood. It didn't stop there. He also attempted to limit the planting of new vineyards, claiming that the empire had become too dependent on luxury and too soft on indulgence. Of course, Rome was Rome, and wine never really left the conversation. People found ways, quiet corners, secret bottles, private gatherings where laughter still echoed over grape-stained lips. But in public, the fruit of Dionysus was forbidden. And for a time, the Senate of Rome, that echoing chamber of marble and ego, smelled less like wine and more like fear. So tonight, as the lights dim around you and the air becomes still, picture a Senate hall without laughter, a bowl of grapes, untouched, a scroll of law that whispers not about crime or conquest, but about fruit, and the man who believed that too much sweetness could rot the very bones of empire. Step into a palace lit by candle chandeliers, music drifting through velvet curtains, and nobles gliding across polished marble floors, each one with a cloud of white curls perched high above their forehead. Why? Because the king did it first. This is a story of fashion, status, and how one man's insecurity reshaped an entire century. The year is 1660. The monarchy has just been restored in England, and on the throne sits King Charles II, charming, clever, and, as it turns out, losing his hair. Charles had spent years in exile during the English Civil War, wandering through the courts of France, where nobles wore powdered wigs not just for vanity, but for status. In France, hair wasn't just hair. It was authority. It was art. So when Charles returned to England and reclaimed the crown, he brought the fashion with him and turned it into law. Well, not a written law, not one you'd find in Parliament, but a royal expectation made very clear. If you appeared at court, you wore a wig. The bigger, the better, and the whiter, the more refined. Those who refused were quietly excluded, not punished, but pushed out, unspoken exile by way of scalp. Soon judges, ministers, and even common merchants began donning wigs, first for court, then for dinner, then for walking through London with any shred of dignity. Wigs became a currency of class, but they were also armor. They covered pox scars. They hid lice. They concealed baldness and broadcast wealth. A single wig could cost as much as a servant's yearly wage. Some were styled into towering, swirling forms, twisted braids, loops, and rolls dusted with white powder and scented with lavender or orange blossom. The wig became a symbol of order, of polished perfection. And Charles? He leaned into it fully. His portraits immortalized him in curls, soft as meringue, rigid as law. Over time, the powdered wig became so embedded in British identity that even centuries later, judges still wear them in court. All because one king didn't like his reflection. So tonight, as you settle into stillness, imagine the soft rustle of silk, the weight of woven horsehair balanced delicately on your head, and a world where a man's authority began not at his lips, but just above his forehead. Because in the kingdom of Charles II, you didn't need a crown to prove you belonged, just a very expensive wig. Let me ask you something. If you were riding through the streets of your empire beneath banners, trumpets, and eyes watching from every balcony, how would you dress? And what about your horse? This is a story of spectacle, symbolism, and the quiet power of presentation. Catherine the Great, Empress of Russia, reformer, philosopher, and self-declared servant of enlightenment, understood the performance of power better than almost anyone in history. She ruled not only through law and diplomacy, but through illusion, through ceremony, through image, and that included what her horses wore. During the height of her reign in the 18th century, Catherine issued a royal regulation. All horses participating in imperial parades must be properly dressed, not simply brushed or bridled, but clothed, in silks, in tassels, in embroidered saddles with golden thread, even hoof covers polished to shimmer in the summer light. These were not farm animals. These were extensions of the crown. To walk alongside the Empress, even on 4 legs, was to represent the glory of Russia. And glory wore velvet. Palace attendants were assigned to equine wardrobe. Designers crafted seasonal looks, rich cranberry in winter, icy silver in spring. There were rules about posture, movement, even how the horses should bow, with light tugs and subtle cues. In the great parades of St. Petersburg, crowds gathered not just to see Catherine, but to marvel at her horses, regal, resplendent, and often better dressed than the men walking beside them. Some whispered that Catherine believed her horses were noble creatures. Others said she simply knew a truth most rulers forget. People believe what they see, and they remember what sparkles. The decree was not mocked, it was followed, because in Russia, the Empress did not ask, she demonstrated. And if she wanted her horses in gold brocade, then gold brocade it would be. But it wasn't just vanity. There was brilliance beneath the silk. These parades were often timed to follow military victories, reforms, or moments of public unrest. And what better way to remind the people of their empress's strength than to send a silent, shimmering procession through the heart of the city? A royal decree without a single word. So tonight, as you breathe deeply beneath your own covers, imagine those quiet hooves on cobbled stone, the sound of bells and tassels swaying, the soft flash of gold in moonlight, and a ruler who understood that sometimes the most effective power doesn't ride with swords, but in silk. If you feared the power of an idea, what would you do? Would you argue against it, ignore it, or would you burn it? This is a story of control, silence, and the terrifying power of forgetting. More than 2,000 years ago, in a land of jade mountains and winding rivers, a man rose to power who would reshape all of China. His name was Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor, the unifier, the builder of walls, armies, and fear. He wanted a perfect empire, one language, one currency, one calendar, one voice. But in the libraries and temples of China, other voices lingered. They whispered Confucian ideas. They spoke of balance, tradition, of rulers who listened rather than commanded, and that was unacceptable. So the emperor issued a decree, one of the most chilling in ancient history. All private copies of historical texts and philosophical writings, especially those that challenged his rule, were to be gathered and burned in great piles by torchlight under the eye of the law. The flames devoured generations of wisdom, poetry, medicine, ethics, all reduced to smoke. The only books spared were those on agriculture, medicine, and astrology, knowledge that served the empire, not the soul. It wasn't just about the books. It was about erasing what came before, what might make people question, what might remind them that power once wore other names. And so, the past was silenced, not rewritten, removed. According to legend, scholars who resisted were executed or buried alive. The imperial court grew quiet. Libraries became tombs of ash. For a time it worked. Qin Shi Huang ruled without intellectual resistance. He built the first version of the Great Wall. He commissioned a tomb filled with 8,000 life-sized warriors made of clay, and he believed until his final breath that he had made China eternal. But the knowledge returned. Later dynasties would recover lost texts. New thinkers would rise, and the memory of the fires never quite faded. So tonight, as you rest your thoughts, imagine the quiet crackle of burning scrolls, the faces of forgotten philosophers, their words curling into smoke, and a single ruler standing in the glow, believing that truth could be destroyed with flame. Because in the story of history, there are many who built, but some who tried to erase. What happens when touch becomes taboo? A gesture of kindness, a handshake, a moment of warmth, all forbidden by a crown. This is a story of boundaries, image, and the loneliness that sometimes comes with power. Queen Victoria ruled for over 60 years, an age of steam, empire, telegrams, and global change. But within the walls of Buckingham Palace, the rules of contact were far older. By the mid-1800s, Victoria had become the living symbol of monarchy itself. To touch her, even accidentally, was considered a breach of protocol, a violation of the invisible wall between sovereign and subject. And so, a rule emerged. No one was to touch the Queen. No handshakes, no guiding her arm, no casual embrace. Even heads of state and fellow royals were warned the Queen was not to be physically approached unless she initiated it, and she rarely did. This wasn't written into law, not officially, but it was enforced like gospel. Guards would subtly shift positions. Ladies in waiting would redirect wandering hands, and guests learned quickly. To touch was not only improper, it was unthinkable. Why? Some say it was a matter of class and tradition, that Victoria believed the crown must remain above, elevated, untouchable. Others say it was personal, that after the death of her beloved Prince Albert, she withdrew behind layers of protocol and grief. Even in later years, as photography captured her in black gowns and solemn stares, there was something distant in her image, as if the space around her had become part of the throne itself. The rule echoed long after her death. Decades later, when Queen Elizabeth II rose to power, the no-touch tradition remained until one surprising moment. In 2009, U.S. First Lady Michelle Obama, caught up in a warm exchange, briefly placed her hand on Queen Elizabeth's back. The world held its breath. The Queen didn't flinch. In fact, she returned the gesture, and for a moment, the old rule cracked. But in Victoria's time, it had never been broken. So tonight, as your breath slows and the room grows still, picture a queen walking alone through candlelit corridors, followed not by footsteps, but by silence. Because in some reigns, power isn't shown through words or crowns, but through the quiet refusal to be held. So many rulers, so many rules. And yet, beneath all the laws and crowns and proclamations, we found something more fragile. People, strange, powerful, frightened people trying to shape the world with ink and silence. This is what history leaves behind, not just battles and borders, but whispers. And tonight, we followed those whispers into royal courts, into velvet chambers and candlelit councils, where even the most bizarre decrees held a mirror to the human heart. If this quiet journey brought your thoughts a little peace, if the hush of boring history helped your mind slow down, you're always welcome to return. The full History for Sleep playlist is waiting in the comments below, with more sleep stories for grown-ups, more weird history, and more gentle moments of ancient wonder. And if you'd like to find your way back here again when the day feels heavy or the night too loud, you can subscribe. This sanctuary of sleep stories will be here, waiting. Now, Let go of the scrolls. Let the strange laws fade, and let your breath settle into stillness. Good night, dear dreamer. Sleep gently, and may the quiet echoes of history keep you company until morning.